Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ICA. I'm Monica Garza. I'm the Charlotte Wagner Director of Education. And tonight, I stand before you full of appreciation. First of all, for that glimpse of spring, that sky today, I'm very appreciative of that. For Jeffrey safely traveling to Boston to be with us. And for all of you joining to celebrate an important exhibition that will soon close before making its way across the country. It's a good night for us to be together. It's also my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers tonight. So let's begin with Jeffrey Gibson. Jeffrey, a leading voice in the arts today, grew up in urban areas in the United States, Germany, and Korea. During his time living in Chicago, he served as a research assistant on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act for the Field Museum. Working on NAGPRA turned out to be a formative experience for him in terms of raising questions on ownership and notions of cultural translation. At the ICA, we were very fortunate to have an opportunity to get to meet Jeffrey when former museum curator Jenelle Porter organized an exhibition of his work in 2013. Over the years, his work has been featured in numerous solo exhibitions, commissions, and initiatives around the globe, several of which you will be hearing about more fully later tonight. I do want to mention also, however, that for his many creative achievements, he was awarded several recognitions, including a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2019. And 5 years later, he presented his work in a monumental installation in the US Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennale, one of the world's most prestigious cultural exhibitions. And then there was An Indigenous Present, this incredible book created with co-editor Jenelle Porter and over 60 contributors that was released in the year prior to Venice. The New York Times book reviews said it best. They said, the book challenges the outsider's destructive fascination with indigenous cultures, inverting and inviting it into a new perspective authored by indigenous artists themselves. The book, unbeknownst to us at that time, would be key for our convening this evening. Jeffrey will be joined by our moderator tonight, Nora Burnett Abrams, the Ellen Matilda Post Director of the ICA. Now, Nora joined the ICA last May after a tenure leading the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, where she shaped a bold strategic vision and expanded community engagement and opened a second museum space. Now, I'm especially thrilled to have Nora here with us today. Tonight's event is actually her first public program at the ICA with us. So with that said, please help me welcome Nora and Jeffrey to the stage.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you all for being here tonight. Everyone kept saying no pressure after she shared that it's my first public program. And I welcome the challenge, but mostly I welcome you, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So we're going to kick things off. We are all here tonight, I think, to learn more about your role as co-curator and organizer of An Indigenous Present. So if you could share with us how your comprehensive publication that Monica held up earlier, by the way, it is quite a tome.
Yeah.
How did the book come to inspire the exhibition? You know, and typically with museums, the exhibition kind of can inspire a book. And so I think one of the things that's so remarkable of many things with this project is that it began with the book. So what did you want to affect or bring about with the exhibition that couldn't occur or materialize with the publication?
Yeah. I mean, well, Jenelle Porter gave me my first solo museum exhibition here at the ICA in 2013. So that's how we first initially met. And I knew that she and Connie, her husband, had made art books. An Indigenous Present, it wasn't even called An Indigenous Present, but it existed in my imagination as a quarterly journal. And it was going to be a quarterly journal that presented Native artists a little bit more in depth and with editorial writing and editorial imagery, something that kind of distinctly placed it outside of academic journals.
And how early in time were you starting to conceive of that?
I mean, if you talk to my husband, he'll say I talked about it when we met, which was 20 7, 8 years ago.
Okay.
And he'll say that I always dreamed about, I think I always dreamed that somebody else would invite me to be featured in a publication like that.
Don't we all have those dreams?
I think that was the actual dream. And, and so I think when I started thinking about this and finally I decided that I just wanted to do it, I contacted Jenelle just to kind of bounce ideas off of her, and she was the person who said, have you thought about doing a book? Partially because of how much work a publication is, and that's something that I was not familiar with. So we started, I think my goal was to have 100 artists, and that's just an artist throwing out a number and being like, oh, 100 artists, let's do it.
Sure.
And then, and I think I knew I wanted it to be 500 pages, I knew I wanted it to be this kind of impractical size, and so that was the beginning of it, and we both, the whole time, talked about it being an exhibition, but we also talked about the benefit of it being a book and curating an exhibition in a book form, because of how expensive it would be. You know, we both have enough experience to understand the insurances, the shipping, the crating, the whole deal, trying to get it into one place. And so, so I think getting through the book and trying to imagine what it would be like to bring this work physically together, but also within the time period, the book process was probably nearly 3 years from us beginning to publication. And so getting through all of that, we had learned about newer artists by that point. Not a huge amount, but we had learned about a good 20 additional artists.
And how many artists are featured in the publication?
64, I believe.
64, okay.
Yeah, 64, 65. And the other thing was, I think when it comes to exhibitions is, you know, it's always been a desire to focus more and to, you know, in terms of the group exhibition, to have, I think for me, one of the things that I've craved for was more topical exhibitions. So kind of displacing it off of the notion of just cultural heritage. And so Jenelle and I have continued being in conversation for all of these years, and so she was definitely the right person. And she's such a tremendous curator, so I definitely leaned into her ability and how much she knows this space in particular.
Space, sure,
Yeah.
sure. Ruth Erickson, our chief curator, has just described to me the moment when she was on a run by the Charles River where she had this idea, what if I asked them to make an exhibition of the book? It was like this literal light bulb going off. And I'm curious for you if by that point, if you had started to think about it as an exhibition, or if you were just still kind of keeping it encased in this book form.
You know, it's interesting. I've had a career which has enabled me to kind of dip in and out of lots of different things. So even when I did the exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, I served as a curator, and I was able to go into collections and bring other people in to collaborate with. You know, the number of other Native artists that I've invited to collaborate and contribute to my own exhibitions, it's really opened up, I think from the outside, people saying like, well, have you thought about curating a show? So that wasn't the first. People have invited me, and I think, I don't know, you know, there is a difference between someone who's trained in curatorial practice versus an artist going in. And no offense to anyone.
I was a curator before a director, so I'll just say yes, I understand.
But artists, you know, we just were, I think a lot of the artists' exhibitions that I've seen were really more collectors. Like we're kind of consuming the world visually, and we're thinking about it, and we're thinking about how it relates to what we're making, and you know, that's our context that we're oftentimes looking in. So it's just different.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that that I think in this, we worked on this exhibition for about a little over a year, and just with 14 artists, and so it's really like it was a lot of work to figure out which pieces, and then of course which ones you could get a hold of, because there's been so much kind of interest and acquisition of a lot of these works.
So can you talk a little bit about the collaboration with Jenelle? Because collaboration is obviously a fairly central part of your work in general. And so how do you, if at all, distinguish between the collaboration that produced this project versus maybe collaboration in the context of your own practice, artistic practice?
You know, one of the things that stands out is, and I don't think I'm saying anything, but you know, when it comes to like a non-Native curator organizing an exhibition of all Native artists, it can be a loaded topic, you know. So Jenelle and I have had lots of conversations about, you know, her feelings of like, should I be the person saying this? And I'm an advocate of like, yes, you absolutely should be. Like, in my opinion, we need more of that. We need more kind of crossover, and we need more kind of allowance of mistakes that are made like in good earnest, and follow up and follow through, right? And so Jenelle and I's relationship has oftentimes been about like, how do we court that conversation, and how do we give space for that kind of conversation? And I really feel that it was important for us to set an example that an Indigenous artist and an institutional curator with as much experience as she has, who is not Native, can, you know, figure out how to make all of this turn into something greater than the sum of its parts. And so I think in many ways I treat her very similarly, in that when I invite people to collaborate with me, I actually never tell them what to do. I basically see it as like sort of like a potluck dinner. It's like, I bring this to the table, you bring that to the table, and I don't actually think the best thing is always to try to make a third thing from those two dishes, you know? It's sometimes it's better just to like
have them side by side.
Let them be side by side. It's more like the pairing and the matching. And so I think Jenelle and I, we talked a lot about where we meet, which is our love of color and pattern. We talked a lot about abstraction. We talked a lot about, you know, our love of fiber, which bizarrely does kind of hold a thread through a lot of this in terms of like color and things. And I think history, you know, I'm a visual consumer of history, and Jenelle is a researcher, you know, so I would go visit Jenelle in Los Angeles, and she literally must have read a good 50, 60 books trying to like make sure she was very clear on all of the context for the work.
And when you were having these conversations, and as you were building, I think it's important to also acknowledge that there are several artists who are in the exhibition whose work is not featured in the book, and certainly there are a lot of artists from the book that are not included in the exhibition. So what were the questions that you were asking one another, or what were the types of ideas you were exploring that brought you to this final checklist? And it's important to note, in case anyone hasn't had the chance to see the exhibition, that there are multiple works by each artist, for the most part, included in the exhibition, which I think is also a fairly unusual approach for a group exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, I've been aware certainly of like the Southwestern Native American art market, and I've been aware of the kind of surges in popular culture that include Native music, art, design, and they seem to kind of happen almost like every like 25 years. You know, there's this kind of like surge in the 90s, there's a surge in like the 2010s, and before that the 70s. And I always questioned growing up, I was like, why didn't they sustain? Like, what is it that happened that there's sort of like this surge and then it dissipates? And so I think, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Can you I just,
of course. How, like, what questions were you asking one another that brought you to the list of artworks?
So this idea of like, what's the anchor of the exhibition? Like, do we need to determine like a thesis? And I think as much as the book was about capturing a moment of this past decade where there's this huge kind of explosion and exposure to Native artists, the exhibition was like, how do we move on to what we would refer to like day 4 or 5, right? So there's lots of language that has come out of this past decade. There's lots of political issues and social issues and different kinds of awareness. But I was like, how do we get to talk actually about the work? How do we allow the artists to forefront their cultural heritage and there being a kind of linearity between what they're making and their heritage, if they want? But like as us as curators, like we're not gonna put that in the picture. So I think we kind of landed on abstraction for a couple of reasons. And then in terms of the artists, we actually really did look at the work to try to think about what worked best. But we also set some rules for ourselves. One was we wanted artists who, based on their decision-making in their careers, clearly wanted to make work that engaged the larger art world. Like, they were looking for a new audience. They wanted to take part in modernist conversations. They want to take part in contemporary art conversations. They're not making work which is necessarily going to have the best context in a cultural heritage center in their homelands. And I think somebody like Jean Quick-to-See Smith or Mary Sully or George Morrison, these are people who sacrificed time and made huge decisions to try to be a part of the art world in New York City, or to try to be part of a national and international art world. So that idea of what defines a career is something that kind of was what we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to show
and that's taking the cue, excuse me, I'm so sorry, from the artists themselves, rather than, sorry.
It's okay.
My first public program.
I know. It's a good thing you're going to have another one.
I hope so. They might not invite me back after this. But that's coming from the artists themselves. It's not you and Jenelle dictating that.
Yeah. And I think, with somebody like George Morrison, I think he's really somebody who, if you look at his biography, he really put himself, he inserted himself into conversations nationally and into art movements. And he speaks about his work in terms of surrealism and in New York studio schools. And, it's so that, and Kay is an incredible person. And so I think that sort of became, and also, this moment that the book came out in is really documenting, I'm just kind of throwing this number out there, but let's say 2013 to 2023, right? So that's kind of the window we're looking at there. So the exhibition was also sort of we're planning it, it's going to happen 18 months from now. What do we think people are going to have an appetite for in 18 months? And we're what's happening right now, I imagine, is going to be what I usually see as dissipating. So what's the bridge we can make to extend the conversation?
Were you also thinking about other exhibitions about contemporary Indigenous art that have been produced in the last, let's say, the last decade, maybe in the last 5 years? Because there has been certainly an increase in those kind of survey exhibitions, whereas this has such a, I would say, more specific point of view in terms of focusing on abstraction specifically.
For sure. And it's interesting because it's I'm still looking at exhibitions that are happening now, and You're
so sweet. Erica Umali, our amazing curator, thank you. Teamwork makes the dream work, that's all I have to say.
I think I'm still looking at conversations that are happening, exhibitions that are happening now, and just as an artist and as a critical observer, I would say my real desire is to see the conversation around these artists, and really, I hate using the word identity in a reductive way, but in the way that we describe each other, in the way that we kind of create space or deny space for each other. It just needs to expand in a much more, I guess, effective way.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is so compelling about this exhibition is that it's works that are engaging with abstraction in a range of ways, through material, through concept, through formal qualities that in many ways have nothing to do with their personal, cultural, racial, ethnic, whatever it is, their background, that it's obviously there is some of that is incorporated because they are, I would say, self-consciously calling it out, but that is not what the work leads with necessarily.
Right. And I think, I've grown up in, let's say, from the 80s to the early 2000s with, let's say, the idea, and I've seen this many times, maybe some of you are familiar with it, but it's if there is a native artist who's working with technology. There's this kind of like riff on like, can you believe they grew up on the reservation and they have a computer and they're working with AI? And it's sort of like, we're sharing this world. Like these aren't necessarily surprises. And even if the narrative is one of like, like what are the odds that this would have come together, I'm not sure that that's the subject of the work. Right. And so it's like the work is to like dive in and to figure out what is the subject. And it requires conversations and it requires looking. And on the artist's behalf, I think it really requires that they develop their own practice.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that really determined who was in the show. We wanted to be able to see development over a period of time, or for some of the younger, more emerging artists, really to, based on our own experience, be like, we see it in this person. We see that this person is so committed that we're excited to see what they're going to do over the next 20 years.
Was it hard to land on the final checklist? Was there...
Not so much. I mean, I think because once we discovered that we wanted Morrison and Sully in it, they really became the anchors. Mm-hmm. And so everybody kind of related more to one of those or the other. And both in terms of like narrative, but also stylistically, like what they were doing. And then it wasn't really to the end of the exhibition that we realized we really had somebody from every decade going back to, I believe, 1910, mm-hmm. I believe. Mm-hmm. And so that was really great. And it was wonderful to be able to acknowledge that somebody had a 40-year career, a 50-year career. Mm-hmm. And then we're looking at some of the younger artists with, a 10-year career. So that kind of just, I think, that probably happened somewhat kind of organically out of the conversations Sure. Jenelle and I had.
Well, it kind of gets to my next question, which is the title of the exhibition and book, which centers the project in the present moment, right? But the exhibition, distinctly different from the publication, explores about 100 years of art making. So you've kind of come at this or discuss this in an adjacent way, but why was like the present so important to you?
Because it's unprecedented. And I think that that's really something that, when many people today as well will say that, if they go to art school and they're an Indigenous person, that they feel that there's not really the awareness of other Native artists to introduce them to help them kind of like develop their own work and like contextualize themselves within. And so I think in my probably 20s and 30s, went to a lot of academic conferences that addressed kind of innovations in traditional processes and techniques and materials and more kind of cultural shifts from an anthropological perspective. And as a contemporary artist, I kept thinking, I was like, this is not the world that I'm drawing from. This is not the way that I think about art making. And so that's where ultimately I stopped going to them, not because they're not valuable, but it was more about the way the information was structured and delivered. And it also wasn't really opening up space for just experimentation and just failure. Because when you're looking at kind of cultural protocols or kind of predecessors, oftentimes what happens is that that's the comparative model that you're looking to as to whether something is like quality or good or valuable or authentic. And contemporary art, the great freedom and joy of it is you're actually encouraged to fail, and you're actually encouraged to fail pretty fantastically. And
hopefully.
And I think, and open-ended questions. And so I think, in particular the younger artists, I think we're really on board with that.
This is going to be hopefully this isn't embarrassing or anything for you, but I'm going to quote you back to yourself. Some people get a little bit freaked out by that.
I have no memory.
Okay.
That's good. It's like...
In other interviews, you've mentioned that one of your aims with this project was to explore the difference between visibility and clarity. So as you said, how do you transform something so you can share it but not reveal it? So I'm hoping you can elaborate on that nuance as a I see it as a kind of structuring device, as a way of letting viewers in, but also not giving everything away kind of at first glance.
Well, I think that not giving everything away is sort of, it's what tethers many Native artists to their communities. Because if you, like for instance, I was not raised within ceremony. I was not trained to perform within a ceremonial practice. And some of the people in this exhibition were. And so the thing about ceremonial knowledge is that it is not meant to be shared because it's not meant to be misused, and you're trained to be within ceremony. And so I think ultimately this idea of, like, that's why Audie Murray's video piece is something that I'm so happy with, because she conceptualized this idea.
Can you just quickly describe it?
Yes, so Audie Murray does a performance where there's a video set up and you can see her laying down a blanket, you can see her beginning a ceremony, and then she rubs bear grease on the lens of the camera, and it turns into kind of an abstract kind of movement of color passages, very, very kind of subtle color passages. And so what I love about that is she conceptualized, and this is something that I see her doing in her other work, she's trying to conceptualize, sage smoke, she's kind of trying to conceptualize bear grease and sound, and I think that that is something which is very exciting for me to see. And so this idea of legibility and illegibility, and what I mean by that is, like, your audience is going to come in with some set of knowledge, and that set of knowledge is either going to allow them to understand, like something I just said about ceremony, or conceptualizing ceremony, making something that is for public consumption versus something which is meant to kind of look inward towards the community and meant to be done for the community. So these are all things that I think contemporary Native artists are really navigating, because the idea of an elder still, I think, shuts us up and sits us down. Like, if an elder comes in and sees your show, you're just so worried they're going to tell you did something wrong. And that still holds that kind of power. And young people, in particular in Native communities, are still very much raised with this idea that is the responsibility of the survival of their culture rests on their shoulders. And that is such a huge amount of weight.
Yes.
And I think art has the ability to kind of give a space where that doesn't have to be weighing down their decision about how they engage with the world. It's like it's a manufactured space.
Yes.
And I think that that's a real thing to offer.
Well, I think it's also accounting for the fact that you're going to have a range of audience members who are going to come and experience and come to each work with a wholly different from each other range of knowledge, and how to engage from those who are deeply immersed and those who are not. And so how do you ensure that the experience for everyone is rich and layered, even if they don't have that full access to?
Yeah, sometimes for me, I feel like just being an artist, that falls into the category of things I can't control, so you do your best. But I think, Jenelle and I also both meet in the fact that, a lot of exhibition making that we've seen has been about trying to meet the audience, presuming that they don't know how to engage with these really complex ideas that artists are putting forth. And Jenelle and I believe that they can.
Yes.
And I think there's lots of institutions who believe, like, people are smart. It's really just about how much do they want to invest in it. But it's not that whether they can or they can't. And so I think with wall copy, we were really careful not to try to insinuate a biological narrative that we have no affirmed evidence of. We didn't want to project onto Mary Sully's life, like, what was she looking at? We really
don't know.
There's not records to show that. And so same thing with George Morrison. He actually did a lot of writing, and Kay Walking Stick did a lot of writing. So reading those things, it's interesting. They had really clear ideas that, because of the cultural context they were working in, didn't get picked up. It was always that they were referring to their cultural heritage. The imagery we're looking at is so directly linked to their cultural heritage. But if you read their writing and interviews that they did, which were not widely distributed, oftentimes they were very critical, much in the same way that I am.
So you started by saying that this project kind of originated 25 or so years ago. So looking back, we see kind of how it developed over these last couple of decades. Looking forward, if you can imagine 10 years from now, what would you hope the kind of legacy or like the long-term impact of a project like this would be? What do you hope are the kind of, the next layers beyond this?
I mean, I think I'm very proud of the book, and I'm very proud of the exhibition. I think that this exhibition is interesting in that, and everyone here at the ICA was a part of the planning, but really it's the experience of walking through the galleries and seeing the shows that people have written me about, where they're like, I didn't think putting more space between the work would make that much of a difference, or I didn't think that different kinds of wall copy would make that much of a difference. But it leaves space for the viewer to be present with the work if they choose to be, with their brain and with their knowledge that they bring with them. I think that that's what I actually think is going to continue happening. I think we'll see more exhibitions with Native artists, global Indigenous artists, and non-Indigenous artists coming together in conversations that are more topically driven. They'll address more the kind of shared world that we live in. I think we're in a period right now culturally where all of the distinctions of how we separate, like land borders and environmental concerns, like they're all collapsing, which is very frightening. But at the same time, it is, there can be benefits with that kind of porosity between kind of boundaries that we think have been fixed. I think it's going to happen. I think it's, I've talked to a couple of people who are, this idea of transnational art histories seems to be really like kind of cropping up everywhere. And I think one of the things that came from the book, which was a wonderful surprise, was the comments we've gotten from art students, and Native art students in particular, who were like, this is like my Bible, that like this book exists, that they can just flip through and look at like 60-something artists, so it'll happen.
I mean, I would imagine that I don't want to imagine. Would you have wanted a book like this when you were just starting to
Yeah, that's also part of why I wanted it in the first place, was because I kept thinking, one of the things that a lot of Indigenous academics and artists will talk about is, the histories, if we look back the last 200 years of documented cultural events and artists and things like that, it's not that they weren't documented, but they exist in these like niche pockets within the over 500 federally recognized tribes. So I know when I was researching land in my family in Oklahoma, I had to go to the Heritage Center, and it's thousands of microfiche film that you have to go there for. You're not gonna find it anywhere else.
Yeah.
So I think, like for instance, Candace Hopkins just produced the performance reader, and really the success of that book is that it collects.
Yes.
It collects and puts in one place. And I think a lot of people are not aware of how diverse Indigenous North America is. And there's a lot of overlaps, but there's also very distinct differences.
Well, and it kind of gets at your original idea of having a quarterly publication that would do that work of collecting and bringing together and bringing into conversation as well some of these practices that maybe beforehand had not been put into conversation together, which is one of the things I think that this exhibition does so well, because you have multiple examples of each artist's work. You see their work in conversation with different artists depending on which gallery you're in, and it pulls out different aspects of their practice, different aspects of the material choices that they're making, particular histories that they might be addressing. To see Mary Sully's work in one room and then to see it in a totally different gallery, it reframes it. And it's not something, you don't need to read a label in order to get that. It's very visual. And
It's a very visual thing.
I think that that's one of the strengths of the exhibition as well, is that you and Jenelle are both so attuned to how we can make visual connect. We can make those conversations happen just on our own.
Yeah.
Without being told to do so.
I think also historically, I think this fear of like getting it wrong has put people in a position of they're like, I need to read about the painting before I look at the painting and form my own opinion about it. And so they're going in with this kind of script of what they're looking for. And I think part of this exhibition is to give people the space to be like, no, you can bring yourself to it, and that is there for you.
It's like an opening up far more, rather than coming in with a closed idea of what you're going to see, or even what you're supposed to see, or even what you're supposed to think, and instead to offer that invitation to come in with an open mind. You don't have to be well versed in this body of work in order to find meaning in it.
I think it also just the conversations we had with the artists, it offers them this tremendous acknowledgement of their own integrity and their own intentionality that never did we ask them sort of like, what does it mean?
Yeah.
That was never a question. It was always sort of like, tell us about this work. And, I think, it's unfortunate that I'm forgetting the artist's name right now, but with the umbrella, the denuded umbrellas stands with the strawberries.
Yes.
That's one of my favorite pieces up there. Gabe, and
the Rondell.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's actually a shame those pieces are not going to be in the next iteration, just for space reasons.
Well,
I know, but I was like, but that's like one of the most. I don't know if you haven't seen the show. Like these strawberries have to be replaced all the time.
Yes.
and you walk in and you're just like, it makes such sense with where she comes from. And what she's working towards, but it's one of those like wild kind of things that it's like.
But that's what an exhibition should do. I mean, a really strong exhibition shouldn't give you the predictable thing, right? It should have these moments of unexpected, wow, I never would have imagined that. I can't believe that is happening in conversation with Teresa Baker's, turf, the thing that is the most artificial material, but the conversation, of course, again, unfolds that way. And, with a group exhibition, there's always the risk of like things feeling like you feel the echoes kind of, and that's important, but you don't want people to be like, oh yeah, I knew that was, I get why that one was, you want those moments of surprise and delight and not confusion, but like questioning.
Yeah.
I think it allows for a deeper, richer engagement.
And I think what it does, I mean, for me, like those pieces, Gabriel's pieces, the questions are not resolved. Like, so whatever question I have in looking at them has remained open.
Yep.
And when I continue looking at work, whether it's made by a Native artist or a non-Native artist, that question that's been opened will continue to like apply, as I'm looking at work by other artists.
Well, I think many of the people who are here tonight, myself included, would also love to hear about your practice and recent projects that you have produced and installed. And so maybe if it's okay, we can transition to talking more about you and your work. We're going to switch the slideshow to pull up images of some of your recent projects. And if you can kind of narrate maybe for us, maybe starting with Venice and some additional installations since then, but also the evolution of your practice. I think there's been a lot of incredible kind of moving in some different directions, and you just don't always get to hear from an artist about why you kind of veered this way or veered that way. So if you can share a little bit about that, it'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that the book was conceived of before I knew I was going to Venice.
Right.
So the book came out in fall 23, and then we opened Venice in April 24. And I really thought the book, I imagined it as this kind of pinnacle handoff of like, I'm going to make this book, and then I'm going to go focus in my studio. And then I was selected for Venice. So that kind of took over the next 2 years of my life. And, Venice was a very particular thing because my relationship to Venice started probably in 2005 with Kathleen Esch-Milby, going there.
Who was the curator of the U.S.
Who was the
Pavilion
co-curator
with
of my pavilion, but also I had known her for over 20 years from her time at the Smithsonian in New York. So they had organized in 2005 for a group of Native artists to go to Venice for their collateral projects. And I remember she and I were like, in a vaporetto at like 1 a.m. And we were like, what if this ever happens one day? And it did. So I think, but what was interesting was we realized for all the conversations that we had been a part of and all the growth we had seen within conversations around Native American art and artists, taking it on an international scale to international audiences is a different thing. And I really felt this need to not just have it be about Jeffrey Gibson, but to bring people. One of the biggest criticisms was because Venice is very expensive, why spend all this money if Native communities aren't able to benefit from it, And so that was part of the impetus to want to bring people over and do so much programming. So we've worked with the Smithsonian on curriculum that will become available to the public school system that focuses first on my work, but then we're extending it to 8 other Native artists with lesson plans from K through 12. And this
is across the country, it will be
available. Across the country, we're launching it next week. And they did such an incredible job. But I think the idea that it had to be so specific, this was not just Jeffrey Gibson's practice. This was sort of Jeffrey Gibson's platform with his work, but then contextualizing it within really a 20th century intertribal experience that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
And so that after that, I really wanted to just go back into my own space and think about what I want to do as an individual. I felt like that was sort of the culmination of that. So Mass MoCA, the invitation happened probably in 2019 was the original invitation. And because of COVID, it got bumped around a little bit. And so I had a lot of time to think about that. And then with Venice, these sculptures, I really mapped out the whole experience for viewers, and the programming was such a big part of it. Venice, we continued with programming. We had about 45 contributors to the video, and just my use of language kind of drew me into the term Two-Spirit. And I chose that because I thought that the term Two-Spirit emerges in around 1991. So we're looking at 30 plus years of this term coming out into the world, but also growing and kind of morphing into something. And there's so many Native histories with so many gaps in it. I was like, we might actually have the chance to have first-person accounts of the 90s, first-person accounts of people living today. And we did. It's incredible. So that, and that space allows for something so different.
Yeah.
And so this idea of experimentation with materials, for me, is really who I am and what I do. And I think challenging what I've always referred to as the narrow lane that's offered to Native artists. And, the way my experience of identity has worked is it doesn't matter really what I do, the world's always going to see me as a Native person. And so how do I turn that into an expansive place as opposed to a reductive space for me personally? And I'm very proud of being Native, but it is just the kind of way that identity works.
Sure.
And so the way we talk about it. So I've really been trying to just be an artist and be in my own space, my own head psychic space, be in my studio, experiment with materials. But that idea of history is still very much there. I think the histories that I'm working with now are much more, very specifically my interpretation of those histories,
One thing that I find really, it's so heartening to hear, and I think it's so important if there are any artists who are here tonight to hear, is your commitment to experimentation.
Yeah.
There are many artists, and I think we can all think of several, who kind of hit a stride and really keep going in that one direction and aren't necessarily trying to expand from that. But you have, I mean, just in how you're speaking just even tonight, and it's visible in the slides as well, that you really are actively trying new ways of making and of articulating an idea, or exploring an idea through very different materials. I mean, we have the Met is a great example of like a pretty distinct direction. So can you just share a little bit about the impetus for that?
Yeah, I think I was going to say that, my goal has always been to make this space of Native American Indigenous identity as expansive as possible. And I actually think that I've done what I know how to do in terms of collecting many, many narratives and putting them together for people to experience. Now I think that, like, because of where I'm at in my life and the opportunities that are coming to me, I have the ability to be the kind of experimental person that in and of itself will expand that lane. It will continue to expand that lane. And I think that that's what I'm really focused on right now. And so, whether it's like public works or it's a wonderful feeling to feel that nobody comes to me with the expectation that I'm going to repeat. And I actually don't
That's
those
like such a great
requests.
compliment.
So like when the Met happened, David called me, David Breslin, and I was so sure he was going to ask about the rooftop commission. And so when he said the niche sculptures, I was like, that's such a bold request because I had never made outdoor sculptures. And of course, I was like, yes. Working with Jane.
Who's here tonight?
Who's here. Jane and I have known each other for a very long time as well, and she's been a real supporter and advocate of my work. And we started looking at the collections, and we started looking at, I wanted to look at depictions of spirits and ghosts and memory primarily in clay sculpture. And also animals, depictions of animals and transformation. Eventually that led into, there were some original, kind of more traditionally figurative pieces. And eventually I just started thinking about my relationship to animals because they're showing up in the drawings on these sculptures. And that eventually brought me back to because I read the Derrida lectures in the 90s, and didn't totally get them then, but I was like, let me reread these, and I reread them, and I was like, it was so timely to think about because I'd been talking about kinship philosophies and recognition of all living beings as extensions of ourselves. So these lectures that he did are really talking about, like, if we seeing them as related to us, it opens up for the ability to dismiss having empathy for them as integral equals. And once we do that, like, empathy begins to just sort of open up to other living beings. So it's not just, not seeing ourselves as animals or not seeing ourselves as part of the animal world, but also each other and the way, and of course when I look at Native histories, and this is not even that far back in my family, but being referred to as uncivilized or primitive or animalistic, I mean, these are all 20th century things, so I think it just kind of came together in a way that I was like, it made sense to make animals, which was the pivot.
I mean,
It's like,
But I also, to what extent did the niche itself and here we have Venice and the pavilion, which you clearly destabilized the architecture in Venice, and you took on the scale of the space in Masmoka, and you clearly engaged so intentionally with the constraints of the Met. Has that, I mean, I can't imagine that that hasn't always been a part of your practice, but to what extent are you in that kind of active dialogue with the spaces where you are making new work?
You know, I don't know where it comes from for me, other than just some kind of naive ambition of like, I think what excited me the most about
That's why we love artists, because that
Yeah.
is what you do.
The thing that I loved about the niches on the facade was that it's really about the street. And I love New York City, and I just thought, as an artist, the opportunity to try to make something impactful on the streets of New York City in a place which is focused and spotlit is like such an exciting challenge. And so, and I've said this to Jane before, I was like, the way that New York City people on the street have embraced the sculptures is not something you can plan for. It could have been like, what are these? Like, he put animals up there, like, we don't know what to make of this. So the fact that, you know, that people see it as just kind of like sitting into the cultural landscape of New York City was really one of the biggest surprises that I'm so happy about.
Are you continuing to work with animals as a
I
partner?
think anthropomorphic kind of animism, for sure. And I think you know, I think the show that was in Paris is, you know, landscape, land, kind of the way we project ourselves into it, but also about our kind of psychic connection to the land. And not just in native cultures, but kind of in every culture you find this. And so there's something right now that feels really necessary about developing that in my practice. And I think, you know, I moved up to the Hudson Valley in 2012, so I'm going on 14 years up there. And it really changes your entire, it's changed my entire,
New York City?
From New York City. It's, you know, when I was younger, I think if somebody told me I was gonna move out of a city, I never thought that would be the case. But what it does to my psyche, in terms of time, in terms of like just being able to focus, it's what I want to impart in the work now.
Yeah.
You know, so I think even for instance the video that's at Mass MoCA, which you see an image of here, that was so much about turning 53, and I have performed in the past, but I'm not. It's like, what does it feel like to move?
Yeah.
Like to be compelled to move. What does it feel like to put yourself in front of someone else, being like a brown body, a brown large body? You know what I mean? It's like our bodies are all these kind of tabulations of our experiences, and it influences the way we move. And that is very much what an animal, you know, especially when I look at traditional dances, you know, it's like to move like a fox, or to move like a horse, or to move like a deer. I think it's fascinating. And there's such a history of it in the lineage of dance, of performance, and art.
Well, but also to your point about at this stage of life, I think you also engage with an audience, like you care or you don't care as much.
Yeah.
You know, I think that there's a lot of like letting go of that as one matures, which allows you to perform, I don't know, less consciously, or like without as many reservations or something.
Yeah, I mean, I really, you know, also the idea of like leaning into the impracticality of art making, I think is one of the most wonderful things.
100%.
And it's not practical. I love telling that to art students. I was like, don't try to make it practical. 'Cause it's really
I also
not.
say it to my board.
Yeah, it's like, it's just not. And
It's not efficient.
yeah.
And that's why we love it, because
Yeah.
it allows us to stretch and expand our conception of so many other things.
Yeah, and it's what's valuable about it. It's really what's valuable about it. And so I've tried to structure out my practice so that there are places where I can part of my practice where it's like I really know what I'm doing and I'm making something that I intentionally want to be out in the world. And then there's other areas where I'm just experimenting and letting the public witness it if I have the opportunity to do that. And that's been they feed each other certainly back and forth.
All right, I think if you are okay, maybe we might invite the audience in case there are any questions. We have 2 microphones, one on each side. If you have a question for Jeffrey, definitely not for me, please raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. No?
There's one up there.
Thank you so much for the insights and sharing your work, and Nora for the interviews. But Jeffrey was wondering what the inspiration was for Powerful Because You're Different. If you could just talk about that. We had the opportunity to see it at Mass MoCA. And as queer people ourselves, we found it very powerful because we are different.
Well, I think it really started when I found that, came across the documentary called Two-Spirit People. It was from 1991, and documenting Indigenous Two-Spirit people in the Bay Area. And one for language, but also because it took me back personally to, in the 90s, there was a member of the Radical Fairies in Chicago who came up and asked me if I was Two-Spirit, if I identified as Two-Spirit, and I immediately said no. It sounded to me like a kind of fetishistic term that I was not ready. It didn't resonate with me. And then through this exhibition, I was able to meet some of the people who were there when the term emerged in ceremony. And the way he described it was so radically different from what I had thought it was like. And he actually described it as a phenomenal portal that like the words took off. Like from 1991, they just took off, and young people suddenly felt that it gave them a space that was not part of the LGBTQ kind of community where they didn't feel fully acknowledged. It also enabled them to perform ceremony. And so I think for me, it was such a fascinating place. And, that's the second series of garments that are there. And those garments, I just really wanted them to function. Magdalena Abanakowitz is one of my biggest inspirations. And I think these garments obviously don't look like her garments, but I think that kind of thing about them being sculptural and being this kind of impractical thing, but also wanted to really lean into kind of drag and queer and camp culture as really kind of emboldening statements, like not the kind of use of camp and kitsch as dismissive or less than, but really as a kind of space. And Denise and I talked about it early on as like, I said from the beginning, I was like, I wanted to be somewhere between a nightclub and a church. We weren't gonna fill it up with a million things. So there's really 7 garments in there, and the rest of it is space and sound and that, the video components. So that it's kind of funny. I mean, it takes me a while to kind of like, kind of feel the effect of an exhibition. And so it's going to be up for a few more months, but I still am kind of overwhelmed when I go in there in a very positive way.
That's great. There's one up.
Hi.
Hi.
Jeffrey, I really like those sculptures at the Met when I saw them. And they felt like they were guardians, and also that they were a new take on what would traditionally be in niches, like in churches and in other places. And I wondered about the clothing, the way that you clothed the animals. It was kind of magical, but I wondered what you were thinking about with what their garments were.
I mean, if you really look at the sculptures, they're like, and this is something that happens with the garments even like in Mass MoCA, is like the garments are the body. And so if you look at the sculptures in front of the Met, they go from driftwood at the bottom, there is no real necessarily body. It's very much like an operatic costume. And so I was even looking at like Chagall's costumes and like set designs, and also looking at like Southwestern deer dancers, and looking at other ways. Like in my tribe, there's a lot of social dances where the movements are based off of chickens and snakes, and just thinking about like where and why and what do we gain from performing like animals, you know? So I always like to combine like where is the actual body, and in terms of dressing somebody, a lot of the references in what they're wearing refer to things that kind of command a respect from me, from elders in community spaces. And so whether it's like the idea of quilts and blankets, or a shawl wrapped, or the jewelry that's on, it was really about trying to give them a sense of honor. And I actually did a number of years ago at the Met also kind of give a guided tour of the exhibition, The Western Bronze. And so I was thinking a lot about that, because there's a lot of animals in there, but the animals are always the prey, or they're always being ridden on, or they're always, you know, in some sort of like heightened state. And I wanted these animals to really be like looking out at the public. So the scale was really important, that as humans we have to like look up at them. So that was a big part of wanting them to feel like sentinels.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe one more question. Now everyone's raising their hand. Up in the last row back. Oh, sorry. We'll do 2 questions. Sorry, I was a bait and switch.
Hey, so earlier you talked about how making art isn't practical. I was wondering if you could tell me what's your most impractical idea? What's something that could never exist in the world that you want to make?
I actually always think everything's possible. I really do. I really think, you know, for an artist, usually the biggest thing is like money. You know, that's usually the biggest thing, is it's like, how are we going to afford this? But I'll tell you, with Venice, we were very successful in fundraising, and the team that I worked with kept telling me, they were like, it's really unusual for artists to come to the fundraising events. And I said to them, I was like, I know this project best. Like, if I can speak to this the best. I felt I could be the most compelling voice to fundraise. And I think, I still feel really confident I can convince people to pay for stuff. I don't know. I mean, but part of that is like just giving myself that permission of asking, you know. I mean, there's a few things that I tell young artists, and I just went back to teaching this semester. And usually, you know, when I tell them, I'm always like, do you know why most people get things? And they're like, why? And I'm like, because they ask. And if you look at any kind of study of fundraising, it's not that the person says yes on the first go. Anything, you never know if they're going to say yes on the 9th go, but it's if you stop at 8 or if you stop at 7, you know. So it's just this thing of like commitment. And one of the things about paying attention to artists, and you probably see this as well, but you know when you meet a young artist where you're like, they're not going to do another thing. They're in this for like, they're gonna give up everything for this. And those are the artists who I love helping. Which doesn't mean that I can hand them an opportunity, but they're the ones who I want to know that, like, I'm your company. Like, I'm the person who did this, like, in the way that you're thinking. So, but you know what? Yeah, that's the naive ambition.
Okay, last question in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. Jeffrey, I was introduced to your work as an intern, and I loved it. And every time you have a show, it's like, what is he going to do now? I had a question in regards to your abstraction versus your text. Yeah. And how you use text versus abstraction and your relationship to both.
Yeah. I mean, I think about text as titling the abstraction, right? I mean, I think if we think about, the way that I think about abstraction is it's predominantly subjective, right? And so I just think of the words as something to kind of name that abstraction. That that was the beginning of it. I mean, I've always used words. I really think probably now when I'm working on a body of work, and I'm doing this right now, I'm thinking more kind of holistically about like what are the larger ideas that I'm thinking about, and I'm collecting words along the way about that. So for instance, like right now, there's the circumstance of like when someone looks at the Earth from space, and it's called the overview effect, and it's where you have this kind of like psychic recalibration that you realize it's like it's one living organism in this massive universe, and we never get to see it from that perspective. Most people never get to see it, but it really messes you up when you come back to the world. It's like, because you realize you're like, oh my gosh, we're all silently agreeing that things work this way with these rules and these words and these descriptors. So that's right now like my starting point, is I'm just like looking through different stages of this overview effect. And there's a lot of trust that what's coming out visually is aligning with that. And then I name it.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been such a special... But wait, there's more. We have a number of programs coming up. I invite you all to come back for them. They will be equally as illuminating. And I also invite you to go spend time in the exhibition. Our galleries are open until 9, and the exhibition closes in about 10 days. So this may be the final time. So thank you all for being here. Jeffrey, thank you again. Yeah. Monica, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.